George, I'm so glad to have you here again.
Thank you.
What do you think about our book?
An excellent choice. It'll be
Good.
fun to talk about
Good.
this evening.
Well, let's talk about it.
Should we start with a few words about the author, Tracy Kidder? Kidder was born in 1945 and graduated from Harvard University. Originally, he wanted to major in political science, but he switched to English after taking a course in creative writing from Robert Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was a publisher, writer, teacher, editor, mentor, friend to many, many writers, including Flannery O'Connor, and he had a profound influence on Kidder's life and his work and his calling. After graduating from Harvard, Kidder served in the United States Army in military intelligence in Vietnam. After 2 years in Vietnam, he left, traveled, wrote, and then ended up, strangely, in Iowa City at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, where he wrote fiction and graduated with an MFA in 1974. His first work, his first book, was a nonfiction account of a murder case, and then he wrote magazine articles for The Atlantic about the Vietnam War. Kidder says that he was not much influenced by his Vietnam experience, and then quickly adds, whenever you're in an experience like Vietnam, it's bound to influence your work. It's inevitable. But I don't really think it shaped me as a writer. Kidder's second book was The Soul of a New Machine, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and he has continued to write nonfiction books, 6, and a memoir. He is a literary journalist, which is a fancy term for good writer. He has a fine, descriptive, matter-of-fact, beautiful style that's very personal as well, and all of his books have a very strong narrative line. It's in his language, though, that Kidder shines. His language is simple and yet very precise, and it's also very much grounded in the senses. Robert Fitzgerald said that all good writing starts with sensory description, sights, sounds, and smells. It's the foundation of fiction and nonfiction, and that's certainly true for Kidder's work. Kidder's nonfiction is utterly believable, and that sounds as if it's a contradiction, but it's not. For Kidder, the nonfiction writer's fundamental job is to make what is true believable. And of course, with this book, Strength in What Remains, we're dealing with the unbelievable, aren't we? Genocide. A homeless man's pilgrimage that seems unbelievable, and yet, of course, the job of a nonfiction writer is to make something that is incomprehensible comprehensible to us. And certainly Kidder accomplished that objective here in this book.
All right. Well, what did you think about the fact that that we chose a nonfiction book this year? In reading a nonfiction book, what do you think you're looking for or getting out of it that's different from a fiction book?
I'm not sure if you're looking for anything different. Most of us look for a story and characters that are deeply involved in their own story, and then perhaps in a deeper story that affects other people too. And so sometimes I think the categories are blurred and ambiguous. And again, Kidder's line about nonfiction and fiction makes great sense
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Because, strangely, sometimes it's easier to make fiction believable.
Right, I wrote that down. To make what is true believable. It's, yeah, I never thought of it like that before.
And here we're right in the midst, of course, of things that are very hard to understand, impossible to understand,
Right.
and impossible to believe. A 23-year-old man in New York City with $200
Yeah,
who
I've been to New York City.
doesn't know what to do, doesn't know anyone,
Right.
and is in dire straits, of course. And yet he's actually, strangely, weirdly better off than when he was in Africa.
You know, when I read the beginning of the book and his landing in New York City, I thought of immigrants who came to this country throughout our history. I mean, some of them, most of them, I hope, certainly not fleeing the awful circumstances of genocide, but some of them were, most of them looking for a better life, fleeing poverty, starvation, persecution of one form or another, and what faith they all have that this place is so bad, I must leave, and I'm looking for a better life. So, there's a lot of that blood in all of our veins, those of us who are immigrants to this country, which is most of us.
This is, of course, very much a story of a journey,
Right.
of a pilgrimage, and pilgrimage is an important word, I think, for many of the characters in this book. A pilgrimage is a journey to a sacred place, isn't it? It's a long journey. It's a search with an exalted purpose. And arguably all of the characters here are on a pilgrimage. All of us are on a pilgrimage. Even though sometimes it doesn't seem exalted, of course it is, because we're trying to find purpose. We're trying to find meaning in our life as we live it and go through it.
And what makes Deo as a character the vehicle for telling that story in a way that grabs us the way it does?
Well, certainly his circumstances, too. Almost immediately, we feel for him.
Right.
Because his country is in absolute chaos. And so is he. And then he's in another country that appears to be chaotic for him, too. And he has to make his way through a very strange land.
Right.
And so we see New York City, too, with different eyes. We don't see it as a tourist. We don't
I'll never
see
look at those doormen at New York City apartment buildings quite the same again. Like, do you take their tips? Yes.
The structure of the book is worthy of much comment. If good writing is always stylish and always structured well, as you enter the world of this book, the structure sometimes is a little jarring, and of course that's intentional, because the story itself is meant to be jarring. We start in 2006 in Africa as he returns, and then very quickly we're in New York.
Right.
In 1994, and he's 23 years old, and he doesn't know what to do. And then we follow him briefly in New York, and then we go back to the 70s.
Right.
In Africa.
Yes.
And the first part, the first section, is entitled Flights, and that's an excellent title for the first section in many, many ways, because all of the characters are in flight. The structure itself is in flight, back and forth in time, from Africa to New York City, and then we go to Chapel Hill, too, in that first section.
It almost reminded me of Driftless that way, the All Iowa Reads year before this year, that it felt that choppiness, like I was just getting into this character, which is what happens in Driftless. In this book, I was just getting into this theme of the story, and suddenly you've taken me someplace else. Yeah.
I think the flight of Deo in the first section is from destitution slowly to a place to live and people and a job, and we see him rising in North America, don't we? And at the very same time, in contrast, we see Burundi falling. If we begin in 1970 or so, then the climax of this first section is the genocide.
Right.
And so that's an interesting, profound juxtaposition, perhaps, that does take some careful reading, I think, but is very much part of the story.
And, you know, if I had Tracy Kidder here, hopefully he'll make it to Iowa sometime this year, I think I would ask him, did you write it chronologically and then break it up? Or did you write it in your mind? Did you go back and forth the way the story goes back and forth?
I think he would say he went back and forth.
Do you?
From the conversations that he had first with Dale and the randomness, I think, of their friendship.
Right.
And he wanted to reflect that and that chaos in the structure of the book.
And that's another thing that as a writer, I would think telling this true story is very different than a fiction writer telling their story, because it builds up over years of Tracy Kidder meeting him, knowing him, and somewhere I read that he was at a dinner at that Paul Farmer's with his wife, and it was his wife who said, "You need to tell this story," but still, it took him years to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Certainly, one of the hardest things to do in writing, nonfiction or fiction, is to render time passing.
Yeah.
And in a novel, time is always a main character, and we have to have the sense of the movement of the world and the movement of time in the world of the characters. And here, time is certainly a character too. And in a sense, it's easier here in nonfiction because we can label the times.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And those are the chapters. And so we're given that information, which nudges us one way or another.
Right.
And fiction writers envy this kind of clarity. I think it's not quite as easy when you're making things up.
Right. But still, the skill that goes into saying,
Yes, of
here's where
course.
we make a break. We're going back to Burundi now, and that
Yes,
piece of the tale. And now we're coming back to New York.
certainly.
And there are even a couple years in there that he skips in the 2000s. And I think, well, wait a minute, did I miss something? And I went back and I thought, no. He just, Dale was through the crisis of finding friends, learning the language, getting in school, and, it was probably not too exciting part of his story.
I'd like to read 5 sentences as a way of showing you the style of Kidder and the progress of Dale. And this begins at the bottom of page 79 in the hardback version. And listen to these 5 sentences, because all 5 senses are fleshed out here. And at the same time, we also watch a theme. It's Dale growing and acting, and it's in his childhood, and it's in Africa. One pair of shorts and a t-shirt lasted a year. He or his mother would wash them at night. In the morning, when he took them down from the rope that hung over the cooking fire, his clothes were never quite dry, and he smelled the smoke in them all day. But you went to school and washed clothes or else. He got his copybook, gathered his lunch of beans wrapped in a banana leaf, and headed out. On the way, he broke off a twig of an especially fragrant variety of eucalyptus, mashing one end with his teeth, then brushing his teeth with it as he walked along. Now that's beautiful. 1 paragraph,
Right.
5 sentences, 5 senses. The sight, of course, the shirt and the t-shirt on the rope, the smell that's with him all day, the smell of the fire that's in his clothes, the sounds, we have a twig snapping, the taste, too. We have a eucalyptus teeth brushing, which we can taste, and then the touch, the not quite dry clothes on his flesh. This is why Kidder's a very fine writer. And this is fictional detail in a nonfiction book. Robert Fitzgerald and Flannery O'Connor would have been proud.
And you know, one thing that I don't know, that I thought about Tracy Kidder's writing here is, it's 5 sentences, but he writes in short sentences. Oftentimes, you know, you'll read a good novel by a good writer, and a whole paragraph will be 1 sentence. And sometimes you have to sort of go back and figure out that sentence. And with Kidder's writing, you don't have to, because the sentences are all this long, but when you put them together, they're so eloquent.
Well, you might think of Faulkner and Hemingway. Faulkner tried to jam the whole world into a long sentence that was sinuously unfolding over 3 or 4 pages. And Hemingway, in contrast, the very short, beautiful sentences, almost like a stream, a clear stream that you can look down and see all the way down because it's very deep, despite the simplicity, or because of the simplicity.
And his imagery, as you say, you know, I just have to say that when he was in his flight after the attack on the medical school, some of those images, I don't have to see them, but those words describing those images will be with me, I think, forever. You know.
And again, he's making the unbelievable believable by being very precise and by showing us exactly what's happening in the church. And as the woman saves him,
right,
and then as he leaves, all of it is, in a sense, in very matter-of-fact language, right, which is opposite to the terror that's actually happening.
Right. And when he walks away and leaves the baby, the living baby, with the dead mother, I just thought, how desperate must you be to know that this is what you have to do?
And it's believable that he left.
Right, it is.
He didn't have a choice.
Right.
Because we knew at that time he was alive, but also dead inside, too. He was like a zombie, in a sense, walking
and no
and
food,
moving.
no water, no... Yeah.
And the moving saved him.
Right.
So he was alive, but just barely. And for the rest of his life, I think, and Kidder refers to this many times, as does Deo, he has moments of incomprehension and weakness, or so he describes it, his inability to make decisions, right, and his passivity, certainly all coming from the horrors.
Yeah. And he's very frank about his failures in that area. I mean, his self-assessment of himself. You know, throughout the book, people advise him to seek the help of a psychiatrist or counseling of some sort, and he doesn't do it. And I'm there going, yes, you need help. You have PSTD or whatever you call it, and but he doesn't do it, and yet he seems to be working through these horrors himself. You know, who knows? Hopefully it would have been shorter with help, but he does it himself.
He does do it himself, and we're convinced of his strength, and at the same time he also does it with a great deal of help. There are people in his life who not only help him, but save him. Everyone from Mohammed, very early in the story in New York, Charlie and Nancy, who take him in. Sharon, the wonderful woman.
Right.
The Benedictine, who for 30 years was a nun, but that wasn't quite the place for me, she says, after 30 years. And she leaves, and she's in New York City at St. Thomas More's Church, and it's her help that certainly helps him.
When Tracy Kidder, the author, describes when he interviews Sharon and talks to her, and she must be a keeper of things because she is able to unearth the documentation of all the places that she tried to find a place for him to live. And, names written on the back of envelopes with phone numbers and little notes. And I remember one of them was a drug rehabilitation center, and he would have to pretend that he was a drug addict to stay there, but she thought it might work. And she just never gave up. And Charlie and Nancy say that about her too. Well, she was persistent. And I think we all know people like that maybe sometimes we're a little impatient with, or we just, push aside people, but, who knows, her persistence may have saved his life.
It's Sharon who says everyone is on a pilgrimage.
Right.
And it's clear in her own life that she's been on a pilgrimage, a sacred, religious pilgrimage. And yet she sees that in nearly everyone she meets, and she treats everyone with great respect and honor. And there's a wonderful section in part 2 that's too long to read, unfortunately, where she is talking about the Holocaust and genocide and how people survive such horrors. And no one knows. She doesn't proclaim to know, but she thinks that it has something to do with love, the infinite love that surrounds everyone no matter what. And for Sharon, there is no ultimate tragedy, even in death, because there's a presence, a luminous, loving quality that surrounds everyone, every day.
And her Christian faith is so strong, and yet she helps a man whose faith is weak at times.
Yes.
And I think that's wonderful. She doesn't say, what started all of this was, you're different from me, I'm going to kill you. And, she accepted it doesn't matter. Here's a human being who needs my help.
Certainly there are many themes here. And one of the themes is religion and the presence or absence of God. Pilgrimage, storytelling, questions and answers, philosophy, religion, uncertainty, the quality of memory, and whether we should remember. All of these are very deep and profound themes, as is politics and Germany and Belgium and colonialism. It is sometimes difficult in small groups to talk about politics and religion. In fact, adults don't often like to speak of politics and religion. This book is replete with politics and religion. And for Deo, from the beginning, what we know of him, his faith is strong, but he's also terrified, and he's uncertain if he wants to live. In fact, very early in 94, he asks God to take his life. He's in New York City.
Right.
And he has nothing. And he wonders if his life is worth anything. And so certainly he does have doubts, and certainly his faith in New York City in 94 is nearly non-existent.
Right.
It ebbs and flows like all of faith, I think. And as he meets people who help him, as he thinks for himself, there's a section on page 186 in part 2 where he explains his faith in God that probably is the faith that he has now. It's a very simple, elegant faith that still questions the presence of God in times of terror.
Right. I remember that, yeah.
And it's interesting to contrast what Deo says with what Sharon says about love and the presence.
And yet, he was he was sort of a chosen one, a special one. You know, his mother sent him to school, and all of his siblings didn't get that opportunity. His mother seemed to have a special plan for him, and so he had, you know, that strong woman in his life, his mother, and then he goes to New York and he gets Sharon and Nancy, and I'm very interested in his relationships with women and how he respects women and not defer is not the right word, but he looks to them and believes in their intelligence and good judgment. You know, at the end, when he has his clinic built and it's getting way too political, and you know, cronyism is coming in, and people who want to have bribes and not do work, and he starts out with a council to help give him advice that includes men, and pretty soon he just turns it into the women's council, because the men were all about cronyism and bribery, and it wasn't solving the problems, but the women knew how to do it. So I appreciated that about him. I mean, you know, here's a book about a man,
Right.
And written by a man, and yet I think it shows great respect for the women characters, and you know, Deo does as well.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking what you were saying about school and how important school was, not only in Africa, but certainly in the United States. He loved school, and he loved to learn. Another great theme, certainly, the questions and answers that were very much a part of his life, not only outside of school, but in school. And there's that great scene when he's in college, and he's at Columbia. Unbelievably, he's at Columbia.
Yeah, unbelievably. Remember when somebody said, well, you must be the prince of an African king, and it's like, imagine what he thought when someone said that to him. Oh yeah, I'm a prince, all right.
But you remember that scene at Columbia, the professor is saying that animals are not rational.
Okay.
Only human beings are rational. And of course, this is 2/3 of the way through the book where we've seen human beings be absolutely irrational. And so this strikes him as being ironic, deeply ironic, and he's been taking care of animals much of his life, and he knows that cows actually are very rational. And so he starts to argue with the professor about the rationality of animals, and he goes on and takes over the class, and the professor is very good to him and listens to him and asks him questions, and they give answers back and forth to each other. It was a cheerful memory for him. And it's a cheerful memory for us, too. That's the best of education. It's the best of the Socratic method. It's the best of questions and answers, and it's a philosophical moment that isn't just a moment in this book.
Right.
It's, again, a powerful idea that's more than an idea, because it's a living reality for all of the characters here. Despite everything, they go on, and one of the reasons they go on is because they keep questioning things, and they keep trying to make things better. Yeah. And the end is evidence of that, the clinic.
Right. And yet, at Columbia, that's part of Deo's journey, is a double major, in one of them is philosophy, and it was a philosophy class and a philosophy professor that he's having this conversation with, and then he thinks that way, and then he turns around. I think his other major was chemistry, something very scientific, and you know, what an interesting person he is, that both of these sides of him, he's trying to do that journey. The journey toward being a doctor on that rational, you know, scientific side, and the journey to understand on the philosophy side.
And for him, it's very much the same journey, actually. I think sometimes we separate ourselves and separate our journeys when they're really one and the same. The search for practical knowledge that also gives us meaning and purpose, because it gets us through days and allows us to know that there's something great, there's something worth doing.
Right.
That isn't necessarily practical at first, but that is.
One of the phrases that gets used early on in the book that I think I'm going to incorporate into my vocabulary is borrowed salt. I love that. He talks about how in Africa people needed salt, and his mother would try and take some of the salt that was bought for the cows and put it aside, and then people would come to her and borrow salt. And he saw that as, if you have to ask somebody for salt, it means you're sort of at the bottom of your resources and you really need help. And then he ends up in New York, and this concept of, I am spreading borrowed salt all around town. It's just two words that now have a different meaning for me, and I will think of them, it's built a story for me in an eloquent kind of way, and now I want to say, well, I don't want to borrow salt. I want people to borrow salt from me. So I think that's something that the author does. I mean, somehow he takes this story that Deo tells him about his mother, and then notices that phrase comes back up from Deo again, and he knows what to sift through. I mean, he must have talked to Deo for hours and hours and hours, and to sift out and find the best that keeps the story moving along, that makes you believe the truth. What a skill.
Story makes me think of the moment when Deo is working at the hospital. He's working at the hospice.
Okay.
And he knows that the people there are dying, and he wants to help them. He wants to give them something. And actually, he gives them questions, doesn't he? Or he gives them commands. He says, tell me about your life. Tell me something you enjoyed. And he's hoping that this will allow the person a good death if they think about something that they enjoyed. And he's trying to pass them on well. And when he asks people to do this, often they break down, they get very emotional, they cry, and strangely, that's joy too, isn't it?
Right.
Tell me about your life as you're about to die. That's a wonderful thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me something you enjoyed. Be specific. Tell me something that gave you pleasure, that gave you wonder. Tell me a story.
Yeah.
Tell me a story. There are many stories here. And in a very real way, Deo is allowing other people's stories too,
Right.
and asking for other people's stories,
Mm-hmm.
which takes unbelievable empathy because of his own story.
Right.
And this book is unbelievable in the sense that we have a man who is not embittered,
Right.
and a man who is not without hope, despite everything that's happened to him. And there are so many details that give us the fullness of him.
Yep. I'm very glad we picked this book this year. I always reread a book because when we're working on the committee, you read so pretty quickly because you're going through a lot of books, and you read a long time ago. And so before we have this session, I reread the book, and oftentimes I listen to it. And for those people in the audience that like audiobooks, this book is read by Tracy Kidder. So it's the author's voice you're hearing. And having read it once, and then hearing him read it, and his inflections and his personal tone of voice and things, I really enjoyed listening to it with the author having read it, and it felt even more personal, like Tracy Kidder was telling me this story. You know, when you talk about stories, that's what brought this thought to mind, is